stopped last week talking about, or actually defining stochastic processes, and our goal was to understand how the RC circuit, how our passive neuron responds to white noise. In order to do that, I need to explain what white noise is. In order to explain what white noise is, I need to explain what a stochastic process is. So we started by talking about discrete stochastic processes, and the idea in discrete stochastic processes is that we have a joint distribution function. Let me just write it down. So we have So in discrete stochastic processes, what we are talking about is a joint distribution of a bunch of numbers that represent events taking place at a discrete point in time. And similarly, in a continuous stochastic process, we talk about some joint distribution of a function. Now this is perhaps something that is some of you may find perhaps slightly ill-defined. What do I mean by a probability distribution over a function? Intuitively, this would correspond to what's the probability of having something like this, an infinite function, that an infinite sequence in time, continuous sequence in time that looks something like this, and the probability of something like this, and so on and so forth. I will not be exactly formal in how we define the probability distribution over function. The next thing that we defined last week, perhaps the last thing that we defined last week, was a stationary stochastic process. And what characterizes a stationary stochastic processes is that the joint distribution is independent of time. So for example, the average would be independent of time. The correlation, do you see when I write here, can everyone see it? You'll have to make the effort. I of t, average of the product I of t prime is just a function of t minus t prime, just a function of the difference. Now, we would be interested today, in today's class, but more generally, in somehow formalizing the idea of noise in the system. Somehow formalizing the idea that inputs that neurons receive, that networks of neurons receive is somewhat stochastic. Yes.
If the joint distribution is independent of time, how come that the mean value of IT and IT squared isn't just the same? How does it change?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
If I as a variable is independent of time, right?
No, I didn't say that I didn't say that I is independent of time. I said that the probability distribution
Okay.
of I is independent of time.
But I is a stochastic variable.
Yeah. I would, yeah, if I is independent of time, then it's not very interesting. Any other questions? Okay, so now we're talking about white noise. So white noise is something that is a theoretical construct. It's not something that really exists. What we have in mind is something like this. Let's say that this is the average. This is 0. So this is white noise. Something like this. Something noisy. And it's a Gaussian variable that has these properties. First, its average is 0. By the way, what does this average mean? Average over what?
Time. Over different realizations.
So I heard two answers from the audience. One said that this average is average over time, and the other answer was that this average is an average over realizations. And it's important to distinguish between these two types of averages. So what does average over realizations mean?
You have a PDF function where you do the integral according to this.
So let's say that we have a neuron. We put an electrode in the neuron, and there is some white noise input to this neuron, and I'm saying that the average is equal to 0. And let's say that I say that the average over realizations is equal to 0. What does it mean?
In addition to each time you compute I, you get a different realization, and their average is 0.
So this means that if I will repeat the experiment tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and each time I draw the input from the same distribution, and I average the input over days, on average, averaging over the repetitions of the experiment, the average would be equal to 0. And what does average over time mean?
In one experiment, when you do an integral, you get...
So if I do an integral of this, and take the limit of t goes to infinity, the average would be equal to 0. And there are many cases in which the two averages are the same. The time average of an infinitely long sequence will be equal to the it's called ensemble average or realization average. There are cases where the two averages would be equal. For example, in the case of white noise, the both the time average and the realization average is equal to zero, but there could be cases where the two are not equal. And we will throughout the course I will discuss these issues in a more formal way. Okay, yes.
I don't quite understand the notion of realization average, because you have to take a specific time, right? So do you mean like I take I of 0 and repeat the experiment?
I'll give you an example rather than
I is a
explaining it.
function of t, right?
I'll give an example. Allow me to give you an example. So let's say that you generate a sequence of random numbers in MATLAB. You use rand n to generate a sequence of random numbers in MATLAB. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that you change the seed every time and you take one number.
Okay, so you take the first number.
I'm sorry?
You take the first number.
No, okay. So
Because you look at I of t as a function of t.
okay, let's think about a discrete example, and this case would be, so I'm doing the following experiment. I'm every day when I come to the lab, the input to my MATLAB seed is the exact time up to the resolution of microseconds. Okay, so I have input. The seed is the time, and I generate many numbers. I use rand n to generate many numbers, and these would correspond to the temporal sequence. So this would be n1, and this would be nt. Now, this is a sequence that I generated, and average over time would correspond to average over this sequence. Now, I could repeat this many times, and let's call this n11 to n1t, where this would be the day that I do the experiment, and this would be this index would correspond to within a day the event, and I would have n m1 n mt. So I have m experiments, each one with a length t, and time average would be averaging in this direction, and ensemble average would be averaging in this direction.
Oh,
So if I'm saying that I of t ensemble average is equal to 0, this should be, or this can be true for every t or for some t's. So this would be averaging in this direction, repeating the experiment, taking a new system. Whereas this would be taking the sequence and averaging over time.
so given, so it's a function of the time. The sample average is a function of the time. Like I can choose
Here.
fix a time and then average over.
Well, in this example, you can let's say that you have some you argue that a property of a neuron, let's say the memory potential of a neuron on average is equal to -70. So one way of doing it, you can take one neuron and look at the average of this neuron over time. And then this is one possibility. This would be the time average. Another possibility would be to take all neurons in the brain. Let's say if you are interested in pyramidal neurons in the auditory cortex, take all pyramidal neurons in the auditory cortex, record them simultaneously at the same time, and look at this average. This is the difference between ensemble average and time average. Any more questions? Yes.
So the initial condition of every eye is different each experiment, right? It's not the same. I mean, it's also a stochastic process. So my question is, if the time average will be 0, then if I'll take enough experiments, then also the realization average will be 0.
this is a property of systems that are called ergodic systems. The time average is equal to ensemble average. In many cases this would be true, but not in all cases. This is a property of systems that are called ergodic systems, or ergodic processes. Not all stochastic processes are ergodic, but many of them are, and we will mostly focus on ergodic processes. Okay, so this is what we are trying to model. So we use a Gaussian. So our process is a Gaussian process. It has some variance. And it has some correlations. In general, temporal processes in nature have some correlation. I mean, when I drew this process, it has some correlation in the sense that if I know the value at this point in time, I know something about the value at this point in time. It's not very different. And I'm going to denote this correlation length as a tau core. So almost every process in nature has some correlation. Yes?
The continuous function, right?
It is a continuous function. Now I'm going to assume that these correlations are in some sense small. And I will be more precise soon I will be more precise about what exactly do I mean by small correlations. So the idea is that I'm going to take the width of these correlations. I'm going to take tau core to the limit that it goes to 0 on one hand, and on the other hand I'm going to take the variance of this process to infinity. Okay, I'm going to take the correlation length to 0 and the variance to infinity while keeping one the variance of this process. I will write it formally in a second to avoid confusing notations. So I'm going to define a correlation function as the average of I of t plus delta. So this was the variance. This was the variance of this process. And now I'm going to define a correlation function to be the average of I of t plus delta. So what's the relation between this variance and this correlation?
Variance is correlation of delta equals 0.
The variance is the correlation for delta which is equal to 0. That is correct. Why isn't it a function of t? Why is c? So you have t here and you have t here. Why isn't, and the average is ensemble average, why isn't it a function of t?
Stationary process.
Because I assume that the process that we're talking about is stationary. Now let's take this drawing that I had and let's plot this function c. So how will it look like? So I'm going to plot c as a function of delta. How do you think this should look? What would be the value of the point in 0? Let's say that this is just let's add numbers here. This would be 1. This would be -1.
My square?
now I want to plot this C as a function of delta of this process. How will it look like? What should be the value for C which is equal to 0, approximately?
Sigma squared.
About one.
About one.
Yeah, one.
0.3.
Well, this is a process that goes approximately from -1 to 1. So let's say it spends most of its time, or typical value would be maybe half.
Sorry, but why wouldn't this be sigma squared?
I'm sorry?
If because delta equals 0, you get I squared.
I get sigma square, and I'm asking you what's the value approximately of sigma square to this process that I drew? Is it 10? Is it 100? Is it 10 to the -3? Give me a number.
A quarter.
Maybe a quarter, something between, let's say, 0.1 and 1, maybe half, maybe quarter, maybe a third. So I have a point here. Let's say that this is a quarter, maybe a third. What would be the value, let's add, so let's say that every tick is 1. So this means the tau correlation is 1 in some arbitrary units. So what would be the value, let's say that this is 1, this is -1. What would happen for a delta which is equal, let's say, to 0.01? What do you expect?
A bit lower than the maximum. A bit lower than the...
How much lower than the maximum? Half of the maximum?
less.
Less than half of the maximum? Something like this?
Or closer to the top, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Something like that.
What would be the value of C when delta is very large?
0.
0. Why 0?
Because there's no correlation in the long distance.
Well, in some sense, we said that this system has a memory of what happened, and the memory length is something like tau correlation. So we expect that far away, much further away from so the correlation length, we expect that this value would be equal to 0. Now the question is, when will it, how fast will it drop? What determines the steepness of this function?
Correlation time.
Correlation time. So intuitively, we would expect to see something like this, maybe. Okay? Intuitively, looking at this, we expect to see something that has this form. So when delta is much smaller than the correlation length, we would expect that C would be approximately equal to sigma squared. When it's further away, much further away than the correlation length, this correlation function goes to 0, and this the width of this function would be approximately something like tau correlation. This is what we expect from such a process. Yes?
Can you please explain the correlation graph? The proper meaning is the correlation between any point and any other point at a given length point? How do you define the...
So I take this. So we have to distinguish between two averages. One is ensemble average and one is time average. And I'm going to explain it for both. Okay? I'll start with explaining the time average. And the idea is the following. I'm going to take a point here and a point at a distance of delta. Let's say that delta is this length. So the point, the distance of delta would be, let's use other colors. So I'll start with, it's the very beginning. I'll start with this this is delta. I'm looking at the delta distance, I have this point, I'm looking at the product of these 2 points. Now I move on, I have this point and this point. Looking at the product, I take this point and this point. I look at the product, and I continue for the entire sequence and I average over these products. This would be the time average meaning of this function. Okay? What would be the ensemble average? The ensemble average would be, I'm going to decide on a particular point in time, let's say the first point, I look at this product. Now I generate a new I of t drawn from the same distribution, and I'm going to take this point and this point, a new 2 points, and look at the product. And I will average over many realizations of this product. Okay? You understand technically what you need to do?
The left part, the realization.
Okay, so the idea basically is that I have one realization of a noise, I have another realization of a noise, I have a third realization of a noise. I take the point at time, let's say t is equal to 0. I look at this is 1 point and this is the other point. I look at the product. Now I do the same for this one. Here I'll have this and this. Here I will have this and this. And I do it many times and I average over all these products. Let's take another example. Let's say that this I of t looks something like this. Where these numbers are independently drawn, these values. How would the correlation function look like? These are in units of tau correlation. So this is I of t. So the way that I generate I of t is I draw numbers from some independently draw numbers from some distribution, and this is I of t. How would the correlation function look like?
Don't you have to have negative values?
Well, I don't, because I didn't tell you what the distribution function from which I drew the numbers. But if you want, let's say that this is 0, just to make you happy.
No, I mean you have to have an average of 0.
No, this is a detour. I'm asking a general question about this, just to see that you know what is the correlation. What's the correlation function? How does it look like? Yes.
It could be some number about third, say from -1 to.
Well, I didn't say what the.
It will be some value.
It will be some value, okay.
From -1 to 1, and then it will be 0.
Okay, so the correlation in this case would look something like this, where this is tau correlation.
No, I think I was wrong. No, it won't look like that.
It will, because no, it won't. Let me think about it for a second.
I think it will.
No, it will go down. Yeah, it will go down like this.
Is that a stationary process?
Yeah, it's a stationary process. So what the trick in white noise is taking these functions, these correlation functions, taking tau correlation to 0 while maintaining the area under this curve.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Please explain what is the
So when looking at there is I'm not defining for a purpose. I'm not defining things in a very accurate way. I'm trying to give you the intuition. So when you look at this function, you see that there are something like ripples or oscillatory, some kind of oscillatory event, and I argue that here the memory, if you like, of memory about the value at a particular point in time is maintained for approximately tau core. I mean, if you look at this point in time, you can still say something about what would be the value here, but you cannot say what would be the value here. So this manifests in the correlation function as something like this that has a width of tau core.
So tau is the largest length that you can do.
In some sense, it's the largest, yes. It's not exactly accurate because, well, maybe you can say you can also say something about distances here, but you have you are already very limited in what you can say. Well, again, this doesn't go immediately to zero. There's some decay. So this is intuitively this is the length of memory that you have in your system.
So how could you know how to deal how to grow the function, the correlation function?
Well, in this case, going beyond 1 tau core, you don't have any information. Because at this point in time, you don't know anything about this. At this point in time, you don't know anything about what will be the value here. And at this point in time, you don't know anything about what will be the value here. At this point in time, you know something about the value here, but you don't know anything about the value here. So the memory length is not larger than 1 tau correlation. And it decays because if you are at this point in time, you can say something about this, but about this distance. But if you're at this point in time, you cannot say anything about this distance. So that's why it decays. So what we are going to do, we're going to consider these continuous stochastic processes such that the correlation length goes to 0 and the height of the correlation goes to infinity, such that the area is maintained. The integral over the correlation function will be a constant while we take tau correlation to 0. So formally the way to define it would be so the way that we will define it is the following way. We are going to say that we're going to say that C of delta would be equal to sigma square tau correlation delta of this time difference. You're all familiar with delta function, right? Dirac delta function. You all know and like. So the correlation in white noise, the correlation function is equal to some constant times a delta function. Now in the literature, typically you'd find this constant to be represented by a single parameter, sigma squared. I often find it useful to dissociate it into two numbers, a product of two numbers. You have sigma squared, which corresponds to the variance of this original process, and tau correlation, which corresponds to the correlation length in the original process. So again, a white noise is a theoretical construct. White noise is not something that exists in nature. In nature, what we have are processes that have correlations. And when we model these processes, it is often useful, and the conditions when it's useful will be discussed will be discussed shortly. It's often useful to think about these processes as processes with tau correlation that goes to zero and variance that goes to infinity, such that the product of sigma squared times tau correlation is a constant. You have a question?
Where do you take the tau correlation, the width of? I mean, you can take it arbitrarily, like here, here. The width of the.
Well, you can ask the same question: what do I do with this sigma squared? Where do I take it? So if I have an original process that I can measure the tau correlation.
No, but here on this function, what is your tau correlation?
Well, taking from so the tau correlation would be approximately what I plotted this width. It would be approximately. But the point that I'm making is that what I care about, what I keep from this original physical process is the area under the correlation function. This is what I keep. The area under the correlation function. What about units? Let's think about the units. So what are the units of, let's say, I squared? Let's say that I is current. So what would be the units of I squared? Would be some current squared, right? What's the units of sigma squared? Something like current squared, because would be this height squared. What's the correlation? What's the units of tau correlation? So how come that the units of this are equal to current squared times time? Delta. What's the units of a delta function? 1 over time. So basically, we're taking a physical process like this, and what we maintain is the area under the correlation function. So basically, the integral from minus infinity to infinity of c of delta d delta would be equal to integral from minus infinity to infinity of sigma squared tau core delta So it's important to remember that white noise is a theoretical construct that represents events that are not, that have some temporal correlations, but for our purposes we assume that these correlations are very short, and what the thing that we take in our abstraction is the area under the correlation function. So after working so hard in understanding what white noise is, what we will do next is to study the response of an RC or a passive neuron, RC circuit or a passive neuron to white noise input. Any questions? Okay.
It's not like not I prime in time t plus delta. It's also I on the
I'm sorry?
the other.
Yeah. It's yeah. Sure. Okay, so we have an RC circuit, and the input to this RC circuit is this white noise. And the question that we ask ourselves is, what would be the response of the RC circuit to the white noise? So last week we wrote an equation for the response of an RC circuit. Plus some initial conditions.
Should be dividing sigma by tau?
Yeah, I should.
And also
Thank you.
minus before the
Yes.
negative.
Any important additions? So, what would be the voltage after a long time? So we think about the behavior of the system after a very long time. And I'm asking you, what would be the voltage after a very long time?
R over tau.
Until die.
I'm sorry?
Until die, we need to know.
I is white noise.
R sigma squared.
This is the answer. Should we vote for it?
Random variable.
Well, this cannot be the answer. Why can't it be the answer?
Units.
Units. Units of sigma are units of I. So this would be current squared times resistance. So unit-wise, this cannot be the right answer. What about this? This is fine as far as units are concerned. This is one good reason why it's often useful to separate these two numbers, although this can be treated as one parameter. So is this the right answer?
No.
No. Why no?
Sigma goes to infinity.
I'm sorry?
Sigma goes to infinity.
What goes to infinity is
No.
if we keep it this way, then sigma doesn't go to infinity. Sigma is just a variant of the original process times the correlation. But why isn't this the right answer? R times sigma.
It's a random variable.
It's a random variable. It's a random variable. You cannot say what will be the value of V at any point in time, given that you don't know what the input is. The input is a stochastic variable. I of t is a stochastic variable. And as a result, there's no way that you can say what will be the value of V after a long period of time. The best you can say is what would be the probability distribution function of V of t as t goes to infinity. Okay? The input is a stochastic variable. I of t is a stochastic variable. Therefore, the output is also a stochastic variable. So, asking the question, what would be the value of V after a long period of time, is a stupid question and deserves a stupid answer. Okay? Let's take a break, and after the break, we will solve this something. באיזה תפילה את זה פרמטר, המכפלה הזאת לצרכנו תשמש לפרמטר אחד. נוח לעשות הפרדה אם אנחנו חושבים על התהליך שיצר את הרעש הלבן התהליך הזה היה לו איזשהו גובה שיצר סיגמה בריבוע, והיה לו גם איזשהו רוחב פעולה בריבוע מייצג באיזשהו מובן מייצג את הגובה. זה התהליך הקודם. כן.
מה שתיארנו זה כביכול ריאליזציה של I?
כן.
כלומר, אז למה אנחנו קוראים לזה, כלומר, אינטגרל של הריאליזציה בריבוע, כאילו נאמר שזה פשוט כאילו ממוצע, למשל, אם הייתי עושה, זה משתנה מקרי לבודד, אז הייתי לוקח בשביל למצוא את הסיגמה הייתי עושה את כל הריאליזציות בריבוע וזה זה היה תוחלת, זה היה
ש-X לפעמים סייפר.
זאת אומרת,
יש כאן דיברתי על שתי סוגים של ממוצעים, ממוצע על זמן וממוצע על אנסמבל. אתה יכול להגריל עבור T מסוים, אתה יכול להגריל שוב ושוב ושוב X.
כן, כמה,
מה הרקע שלך? מה למדת? לא למדת משתנים רצופים?
כן,
קורסים כמות סטטיסטיקה? עשית דברים כאלה? כאילו התעסקת במשתנים סטוכסטיים רצופים?
לא בעצם חסכתי. בסדר.
כן.
אני מבין אוקיי, א', קצת הפריע לי איך אתה מגדיר את התא הקורלציה.
השאלה בדיוק של איך אני מגדיר את תא הקורלציה לא חשובה.
כי אתה עושה ממוצע.
כי מה שמעניין אותי בעצם זה האינטגרל לאינפינית הקורלציה. אינפינית ה-T. מה שאכפת לי זה הגודל הזה, האינטגרל לאינפינית.
כן, אני מבין באופן אינטואיטיבי למה שזה מתכוון למקסימום, זה גדל, אז זה הולך דווקא ל-10, אבל לא יודע, איך אני רואה את זה, כאילו זה רק אינטואיטיבי כזה.
נכון, בכל
יכול לנחש, שנגיד מהתקופה גדול, אתה יכול לקבל פעם לקבל מינוס, פעם פלוס, פעם זה, בערך.
בתרגיל הביתה לרעש חלר, רעש לא רעש לבד. שם אתה תראה באמת, אתה תראה את זה ותראה את הרעש. איך להבין את הסיד או אפס.
איך אני מודד פה, מה הביטוי האנליטי נגיד של ציירת את הפונקציה, מה, ממש נומרית לכל...
לא נומרית, לכל אנליטי, בדוגמה שנתתי...
איך אני אקבל ביטוי אנליטי לזה?
אתה רוצה להסתכל נגיד על I של T?
לא, אני רוצה להסתכל על קורלציה של זה.
I של T, I של T פריים. אני כזה נגיד I של T.
זה.
I של T בסדר. עכשיו, התהליך לעשות את הצורה הזאת. עכשיו, בוא נתחיל בנקודה הזאת. יש כאן, נחלק את זה, יש כאן, נחלק את זה זה שווה לאינטגרל מ-0 עד תאו קור. מה זה I של T? חד חלקי תאו קור. עכשיו של מה? של I של T. I של שנייה, של I של T פלוס דלטה dt. עכשיו, בוא נניח שדלטה, נסתכל עד איזושהי, נניח שהגודל הזה הוא דלטה. כשאני הולך בנקודה הזאת, הנקודה הזאת עולה כאחד. או שם קורלציה זה I בריבוע. הזאת הקורלציה היא I בריבוע. עד הנקודה הזאת היא הקורלציה I בריבוע. מה זה שווה? זה שווה ל-1 חלקי כלל קורלציה. כפול מה? באינטגרל אני הולך עד לנקודה כלל קורלציה פחות דלתא. עד לנקודה הזאת, כפול ממוצע של I בריבוע. אתה יכול גם להגיד לי באמצע השיעור אם אתה רואה ששכחתי.
כן?
כן. ועוד מה? ועוד התרומה באזור הזה, דלתא, כפול I פריים. הקורלציה בין הנקודה הזאת לנקודה הזאת.
I prime זה
יש כאן, לא זהיר בסמינית. יש לו ערך קבוע I, ואז תופס I פריים, ואז תופס I פריים פריים. כשאני עושה את האינטגרל, כל עוד אני באזור הזה, אני מקבל I בריבוע. כשאני עובר מכאן לכאן, אני עובר I פריים. זה ממוצע את זה. לכן, מה שנשאר, אני נשאר עם הביטוי הזה. ולכן בכף הציירתי, חשבתי אנליטי.
אבל זה כי יש לך I אנליטי, ואתה יכול להסתכל לחשוב אותו איזשהו משהו. פה אתה לא יכול, אתה לא סלימר, אתה חושב לזה.
זה ציור, אתה יודע, לא הגדרתי לך את הפונקציה, אתה לא יכול להגיד.
זאת השאלה שלי, אם זה מצוין את האינטגרל ולקבל...
נומרית אתה גם יודע.
אבל אמרת לי שאפשר לקבל אנליטית לזה משהו.
זה לא מוגדר היטב. לא הגדרתי את הפונקציה הזאת, אבל בתרגיל אתם תעשו משהו עם משהו שנראה ככה.
אז כאילו אתם רעש גאוסיאני, אז אני אקבל גם קורלציה נגיד גאוסיאני.
Yeah, hi. Well, it represents the strength of the this is a relevant I'm trying to think how exactly to answer your question. It turns out that this is a relevant when the length of the correlation in the input are much shorter than the characteristic timescale of the system which integrates over this input, it turns out that it is the area under the correlation function which is the relevant parameter for the extent to which the input drives the system. It is important because let's say that the correlation length is very, very small. Now, put something like this. Okay? So, this would drive the input up, but this would drive it down. And this would drive it up, and this would drive it down, and it would average out, and there will be no effect. Unlike something that looks like this. So we have a lot of time for driving it up, and then a lot of time for driving it down. So that's why the correlation length is important. And perhaps after solving this function, after doing the homework assignment, it will become clear why it is the area that matters.
So, to summarize, the area under the curve is, I'm unable to say what you just said.
The area under the correlation function is the relevant parameter in order to calculate the extent to which input has an effect on the function. You still look sick. Are you okay?
Thank you.
כן, מה אני יכול לעשות שלך?
שמי הרן ואני תלמיד בשנה השנייה בהרצל.
כן.
יש לי מחקר שמאשר את הלימודים שלי במרכז השגרירות האמריקאית, מחקר סטנדרט שעד עכשיו הייתם עליו, אבל אני לא רוצה להקשיב לך.
למה אתה צריך לשגרירות האמריקאית?
יש לי ויזה. מסלול, הוא מחויב לפה,
אוקיי.
זה סטנדרט שהם נתנו לכל תלמיד עד עכשיו ב-UTSC.
אתה רואה אצל יוני?
כן, אני מתחיל. התחלתי כבר למעשה.
ומה אתה עושה שם? אצל יוני?
אנחנו עושים בחצי שנה הקרובה פרויקט, ניסוי חצי מוכן שכבר יש לו. אני מקווה לגבש שם רעיון לדוקטורט בחצי שנה הקרובה.
אוקיי.
תודה, יונתן.
כן. כן. מה שאנחנו עושים, אנחנו בעצם דנים ברעשים שהם יותר ויותר גבוהים ויותר ויותר קצרים.
כן, קונספטואלית זה אני מבין, רק כאילו התמונה הזאת היא שהזמן קורה לצלף לאפס, אני חשבתי שזה הולך לאפס וזה הולך לאינסוף,
נכון.
השאלה שלהם,
נכון.
עכשיו אמרת סטיגמה לא הולך לאפס.
זה התכונות של הרעש המקורי שאותו אנחנו למדים. הוא יש לו גודל סופי, יש לו קורלציות סופית. אנחנו מחליפים את האינפוט המקורי בקונסטרוקציה התיאורטית הזאת, שיש לה אמפליטודה שהיא אינסופית, בגלל פונקציית הדלטה, וקורלציות שהן אפסיות. ככה שהאינטגרל על פונקציית הקורלציה נשמע.
אבל זה כבר בעצם לא הזמן קורלציה,
זה הזמן קורלציה של הפרוסס הקודם, כן, בשרית של הפרוסס.
אבל זה לא הזמן קורלציה של
התהליך הזה יש לו זמן קורלציה.
כן, זה מה זה היה מבלבל. זה לא השינוי של...
כשאנחנו מתייחסים נניח לביטוי שהמטריד מין אינטגרל של המתח, אז הזרם שיש לך מתחת לאינטגרל זה כבר הריאליזציה של ה-white noise אחרי
כן, אנחנו נחקור את הסיפור של ה-white noise.
אבל רק כדי לשים כאן את הדגש על ההבדל בין ההתפלגות של ממנה אתה מתחיל, שלה יש זמן קורלציה סופית ושלא סופית. אחר כך אמרנו שאנחנו מייצרים את הקונסטרוקט המתמטי הזה שיש לו זמן קורלציה אפס ושונות סופית. אז על מה מהם אנחנו מסתכלים באינטגרל הזה?
אנחנו נחקור את המקרה הזה.
Just a quick question.
I used to have to simulate actually this.
Sure.
Okay, now that we understand what white noise is, we can study how white noise input would affect our passive neuron. And I asked you a stupid question of what would be the value of the Merman potential after a long period of time. And this was stupid because you couldn't answer the question. A more interesting question would be what would be the probability distribution over the voltage after a long period of time. And since I said that white noise is a Gaussian distributed Gaussianly distributed, then V would also be a Gaussian. The distribution of V would also be Gaussian. So all we should care about is the mean and the standard deviation. So let's talk about the mean first. So what would be the average of V over time? So this is very easy. It's just equal to R over tau, an integral dt prime e to the minus t prime over tau, average over I, plus initial conditions. And what's the average of I? 0. So what's the average of V? 0. That was easy. Yeah, I'm taking the limit of t goes to infinity.
You integral I of t, not t average, not t expected of I t, right? You do integral.
I'm looking at the average of V. Okay? So this is average of this integral. Integral is like a sum. Sum of average is average of the sum. Average of the integral is like the integral of the average. Okay, this is something you should know from previous studies. Okay, so we know that the average over the average potential is equal to 0. The next thing to compute would be the second moment, or would be the correlation. So how do we solve this? These are the correlations. We need to write the product of these two integrals, right? We need to write the product of these two integrals and then average over this product. So let's do it. So this is equal to R squared divided by tau squared. We have two integrals. 1 over dt prime and 1 over dt prime prime. E to the minus 2t plus delta minus t prime minus t prime prime divided by tau, average of I of t prime, I of t prime prime, average. Is it clear what I did here? So I did two things. First, I wrote the first integral, and I wrote the second, and I looked at the product of the two integrals, and in order to avoid confusion, I used different dummy variables. One I called dt, one is t prime, and one is t prime prime. This is one thing that I did, and the second thing is that the average of the integral is the integral of the average. Questions on this? I'd like to encourage you to ask questions if there are things that you don't understand. Yeah. Here?
Yeah. So are we assuming the initial conditions are 0, or is the average of V 0 regardless of the initial conditions, or?
Well, we take the limit of t goes to infinity, and the initial conditions decay exponentially fast. so we don't care about it. Otherwise, you'll have initial conditions will be important. So what's the next step? We substitute this term. We can substitute this term here. Let's see what this would yield. R squared divided by tau squared. This is this term. And from this, we will have sigma squared tau core. And we are left with the two integrals. I will do it slowly this time because you will encounter these kinds of integrals in the future. Minus 2t plus delta minus t prime minus t prime prime divided by tau delta of t prime prime minus t prime. What's the next step? Which integral should we do? The first one or the second one? Why should we do the second one first? So how do we approach this problem? This term is not equal to 0 only when t prime is equal to t prime prime, right? Otherwise, this integral this term doesn't contribute anything to the integral. So the only contribution to this integral would be when t prime is equal to t prime prime. So now we need to consider or think about the conditions under which t prime can be equal to t prime prime. So let's look at t prime and t prime prime. T prime goes from 0 to t. T prime prime goes from 0 to t plus delta. And let's assume for the sake of argument that delta is, let's say that delta is positive. So let's say that t prime prime, let's consider the case. Let's consider the case that where t prime prime is larger than t. Let's consider the case that t prime prime is larger than t. What can we say about this case? The case of t prime prime is larger than t. For example, t prime prime would be equal to t plus delta over 2. Why will it vanish? I'm sorry? Well, but maybe t prime would also be equal to Why is t prime smaller than t? T prime is smaller than t because the integration over t prime goes from 0 to t. T prime is necessarily between 0 and t because the integration over t prime is from 0 to t. So if t prime prime is larger than t, then necessarily t prime would be different from t prime prime. And then there will be no contribution. Put differently, we can look at the second integral and divide it into an integral from 0 to t, and an integral from t to t plus delta. The second integral will not contribute anything, because in the second, for the second integral, t prime prime would be larger than t, and t prime would be smaller than t, and this term would always be 0. So one thing that we can do, well, this was easy, is to delete or to ignore the second part of the integral from t to t plus delta. So I can do this because of the delta function, because when t prime is larger than t, t prime will always be different from t prime prime. Questions about this? Is it clear to everyone, this argument? Has anyone understood this argument? Good. Okay, so what's the next step? What's the next step?
To get rid of one of the
We can integrate over the delta function.
Make it a single integral.
Make it a single integral. So let's integrate over t prime prime, and then the only contribution will be when t is equal to t prime. So doing this integration, what we get is this is equal to r squared divided by tau squared, sigma squared, tau correlation, times integral dt prime e to the minus, we have tau here, 2t plus delta minus 2t prime. Are you okay with this integration? And this is just equal to r squared divided by 2 tau sigma squared tau correlation e to the minus delta of tau. So what's any questions about the math?
Why is it 2 tau in the final result?
Because it's integral over t prime, and you had here 2 t prime. Just do this. Conjugate divide, and this will give you 1 over 2. So this 2.
I mean the 2 tau of, under the r squared.
Oh, when you say that it should be 2 squared, tau squared.
It should be
No, because I have this tau from here.
Okay.
It's always useful to check the results and with respect to units. So let's say this sigma squared has units of current squared. R, well, resistance squared. So this should be voltage squared. And we have tau and tau, which both have units of time. So we are fine with respect to units. The outcome has units of voltage squared, and here we have tau, units of time, delta units of time, so answer has to be correct.
You took the limit of t goes to
Yeah,
infinity.
we're only interested in the limit of t goes to infinity. I don't know, I deserve this. So what's the interpretation of this result? We took a white noise. This is a signal that has no temporal correlations, none whatsoever. We injected this input to our RC circuit, and what's the result? The result is again, it's a stochastic variable. It's a stochastic, more precisely, it's a stochastic process that has zero mean. Perhaps it was not surprising that the mean of the input was zero, but it has correlations. And the length of the correlations are tau. So these correlations decay to zero when delta is substantially larger than tau. So if you remember, last week we talked about RC circuits as low-pass filters. So what this RC circuit did was to take the white noise and filter out the high frequency components, such that what was remained is the low frequency components, or in other words, those components that had correlation that is these correlations of length tau. So somebody asked me during the break about how do you compute correlations of a process of a stochastic process. So this is an example where we computed the correlations of a stochastic process that has some that you can think about the V as a stochastic process, but it's no longer a white noise. It's a stochastic process that has the temporal correlations. And one thing that you would do in your homework assignment, you would compute the response of an RC circuit to colored noise, to noise that has the temporal correlations. Any questions about that? Yes.
I didn't understand yet. Does the RC circuit find the low frequency correlated signal within the white noise? That's what it does?
Yeah, you can think about the white noise. One way of thinking about it, you can do a Fourier. You can decompose the white noise in the Fourier space, and then you get all possible frequencies, all possible taus, and the white noise suppresses the high frequency and maintains the low frequency component in the Fourier space. Any more questions? So now that we are tired, we can go we're tired about the passive neurons. We want to know something about active neurons, about the non-passive properties of neurons, and this is what we're going to do. Questions again? So far we approximated. Thank you. So far we approximated neurons as passive RC circuits, but this is obviously not true. And when we record activity of individual neurons in the brain, we see something like this. Most of the time, the membrane potential fluctuates around values which are perhaps minus 60 or minus 50 or minus 70 millivolts. These are values that are dominated by the difference in the concentration of potassium ions between the inner side of the cell and the outer side of the cell. But from time to time, we see these stereotypic events that are known as action potentials. Now, I know that many of you know everything that you want and need to know about action potentials from the biology courses you took in the first semester, but in the benefit of those students that come from other disciplines, not from EdSec, I will say a few words about the action potential. So these are the action potentials. These stereotypic events that from time to time you see when recording the neural activity of neurons. And these are of great interest to us because similarly to what we said in last week about the neuron as a basic computation unit, the action potential is a basic communication unit. It is the basic communication unit in the sense that in most cases, neurons down the road, postsynaptic neurons, the only thing that they know about activity that is taking place in the presynaptic neuron, the only thing that they know is the timing of these stereotypic events that are called action potentials. This is not exactly true. I'm lying a little bit, I'm cheating a little bit, but it's a good approximation. So if the neuron is a basic computational unit in the brain, the action potential is a basic communication unit in the brain in the sense that the postsynaptic neurons don't know anything about these small events. They don't know and they don't care, but they do know something about these events. These are the events that are transmitted to neurons down the road, and we'll not discuss it today, but in next week or the week afterwards we will talk about how this happens through synapses. But for the time being, just take my word that these are the events that transmit information in the brain. That's why we care about them. And one thing that is the characteristic of these events is that they are very stereotypic. Yes.
You said that postsynaptic neurons know mostly about the time of these events.
They know the timing of these events.
So
yes.
there is no information stored in the magnitude of the action?
No, these events are very stereotypic. So they look very much the same, and this is an example, if you like. What you see here is this is a different kind of cell. These were pyramidal cells. These are pyramidal cells in the cortex. These are Golgi cells in the cerebellum. What you see here is the response of these cells to current injection. So what they did in this experiment, they injected the hyperpolarizing current, constant hyperpolarizing current to these cells, so they're hyperpolarized and they don't emit any action potential. And then they tested the response of these neurons to relatively short, or 2 seconds long pulses of depolarizing input embedded within this hyperpolarizing current of different amplitudes. And what you see here, this is the characteristic for this neuron, but this is more general for many neurons in the brain. When the input is relatively small, the cell emits a relatively small number of action potentials. And when the magnitude of the input is large, the frequency of the action potential is large, but the shape of these events is more or less conserved. And in most cases, or at least that's a general belief, that the neurons, that the postsynaptic neurons don't know anything about this shape, and they don't care anything about this shape. Any questions about this? So, if you look at the more recent literature. Some people talk about the diversity of action potentials in the central nervous system. So this is one review from a few years ago, and depicting different action potentials in different neurons. These are Purkinje cells, and these are pyramidal neurons. Just note that the time scale is different. These are 100 milliseconds, this is 40 milliseconds. These are the cholinergic neurons, and let's ignore the right-hand side of this figure. And there are differences. Not all action potentials in all brain regions are identical, but to a good approximation there are. So for our purposes, we don't care about these minute, tiny details, and for us, all action potentials are the same. But note that if you're really interested in studying CA1 pyramidal neurons, or if you're interested in studying Purkinje cells, you may care about the differences in the exact shape of the action potential. But to a first approximation, all action potentials within a neuron are the same, and all action potentials between neurons are the same. The first approximation. And one property of an action potential that is I think very interesting is the fact that it's a binary event that is characterized by a threshold, and this is depicted here. You have a neuron, and you inject some current to it, and you get this sub-threshold response. This response is actually very similar to the passive responses that we discussed today and last week. What you see here is the memory potential as a function of time. But if the magnitude of the input is slightly larger and exceeds a value that is considered as a threshold to the neuron, you have this characteristic event, this action potential. The time scale of an action potential is approximately, as you see here, something like a millisecond, and immediately you should start asking me, how come if I told you that the characteristic time scale of these RC circuits that are supposed to represent the passive properties of the neurons, their characteristic time scale is on the order of maybe 10 to 100 milliseconds. Any questions about the action potential? Yes.
How come
Or objections? You can have those that know biology can also object to many of the very general statements that I made. Yes.
I've never noticed this before, but if CA1 neuron is firing, it doesn't go below the threshold. Why is in the CA1 pyramidal neuron doesn't get hyperpolarized?
Eventually it does.
Very slowly.
I mean, you can see it here. You don't have this after the hyperpolarization. I don't know why. I mean, I guess I can look it up, but I can't give you an answer why this particular neuron is different, for example, from the Purkinje cell. I guess it's related to the fact that the firing rate of these neurons is very low, is substantially lower. For example, Purkinje cell can go up to, well, depending who you ask, but definitely above 100 hertz. So these are, whereas these neurons are typically, the firing rate of these neurons is substantially lower. Yes?
Maybe I don't understand, but there does seem to be one macroscopic difference in that the first sample you have doesn't have a long tail. And that is a macroscopic. Well, the first one, all the way up on top. There's no long tail, which is something which should act on the scale of the shooting frequency, no?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question.
What I'm saying is, you could say that the shapes are different. It doesn't matter that the shapes are different, but between the first example and the second two examples, there is one difference, and that is that there is no tail.
What do you mean by tail?
The tail of the decay of the response.
Okay. Well, I mean, I showed these examples on purpose so that you will know that I'm lying to you by saying that all action potentials were made alike. However, I mean, look at the time scale. So this, what you call a tail, is on the order of maybe I don't know, well,
Consistent, 40
yeah,
milliseconds.
maybe
That's
40
already a scale
milliseconds.
of 100 milliseconds from your first example. That's what's bothering us there. You have 40 milliseconds on the second one, and 100 milliseconds on your larger picture.
Well, the thing is that if this cell fires, if this cell fires at a rate of something like 1 hertz, then you don't care much. Now, the second question to ask is, how should you interpret this? What are the consequences of this, what you call a tail, with respect to the next action potential? That's one question. And the second question is, who cares about it, in the sense of whether the postsynaptic neuron knows something, whether it knows something about this, what you call a tail. And the answer is, to some extent, the answer to if you dig deep enough, you will find that these properties do matter for something. But for our purposes, we will approximate our neurons not caring about the shape. But I'm showing it on purpose so that somewhere deep in your mind you will know that things are more complicated than the way that I'm presenting. Any more questions? So the fathers of the action potential are these two gentlemen, Hodgkin and Huxley, and that both characterized the action potential and came up with a very useful mathematical description of the action potential that partially based on the biophysical mechanism. So this is the work that was done in the 30s and in the 40s. This is the computer. This is how they simulated the equations. And the experiment that they did were very nice experiments. They were using this animal, the European squid, and the way that squids propagate, they have this they have a large number of muscles that contract simultaneously, and as a result of this contraction, they eject water, and then the animal moves something like this. And this axon that innervates these muscles is a very large axon, because it innervates a large number of muscles. It is so large that it's on the order of 0.5 millimeter. The width of this axon is on the order of 0.5 millimeter, and what Hodgkin and Huxley did was to take this axon and to put an axial electrode in the axon. I need an axon. So if this is the axon, they took a metal electrode and put it like this, long metal electrode, like this, and this enabled them to study the properties of the membrane of this axon in a very precise way. And this is an example of an action potential propagating in this axon in the original from the original paper of Hodgkin and Huxley. Very nice experiment. So the way that they modeled the action potential, the stereotypic event, is perhaps conceptually very similar to our RC circuit. And the only difference between the model that we discussed last week and the model of Hodgkin-Huxley is that the conductances, the sodium and potassium conductances, are not constant, but are voltage and other things dependent. So these conductances or these resistors are not constant but change. And these changes in conductances allow the membrane to respond in this stereotypic binary way, allow the membrane to generate an action potential. And what we will do today is we will try and understand these active properties of the action potential. Questions? And the way that we will do it is the following. I will describe the Hodgkin-Huxley equations. I apologize to all those that already know these equations. I will give you an intuition to why they work and why they generate the action potential and what are their properties. And then we will move to a simplified version of the Hodgkin-Huxley equations that can be solved analytically or semi-analytically. And what we will gain from this exercise is two things. First, a more precise and analytical understanding of how an action potential is generated. And the second thing that we will gain is this can be considered as an introduction to nonlinear dynamics, and we will learn tools that will allow us to study nonlinear differential equations, and these tools will be useful when we will study not only the dynamics of single neuron, but also dynamics of neuronal networks. Questions? Okay, so these are the equations that characterize the dynamics of the membrane potential according to the Hodgkin-Huxley model. We have something like an RC circuit. This RC circuit receives four kinds of currents. There is external current, which we inject to it. There is a leak current. This leak current is like the garbage bin of the model. All other conductances and batteries don't go into the dynamics of the potassium and sodium current, goes into the leak current, and this leak current is basically the same current as it's mostly composed of potassium current, and this corresponds to the passive properties of the membrane potential of the cell. We have in addition to this leak current, we have active potassium and active sodium currents. And so just modeling the leak current, we say that the leak current is equal to the leak conductance times the difference between the membrane potential and the leak battery. So far, this is exactly identical to what we did last week, exactly identical equations. The new thing are these two active conductances. One is active potassium conductance. This is equal to the potassium conductance times the difference between the membrane potential and the potassium battery, and sodium current, which is equal to the sodium conductance times the difference between the membrane potential and the sodium battery.
I is an external?
I is an external current, yes, what we inject as experimental. Questions? So all the interesting parts of the Hodgkin-Huxley equations are what's going on with these potassium and sodium conductances. So according to the Hodgkin-Huxley model, the potassium conductance is equal to some constant times a stochastic variable to the power of 4. And I will not have time to explain why it should be to the power of 4, what the biophysical correlate of this power. And but the point is that the potassium conductance is gated by a dynamic variable. This dynamic variable depends on two things. It depends on time has some dynamics, and this is the dynamics of this gating parameter, and the dynamics is change over time in the value of n is equal to some n infinity v minus n, where n infinity has this shape. This is the blue line. It's voltage dependent, and also the tau, the characteristic time of this dynamics is not constant, rather it changes over time. I'm sorry, it changes over voltage, it depends on the voltage. Now, the shape of this equation and the parameters that characterize it were measured by Hodgkin and Huxley, and again, they correspond to, they can be related to the microscopic properties, or to some extent, they can be related to the microscopic properties of the ionic channels that determine the conductance of these neurons. Questions so far? Yes.
Isn't n a probabilistic parameter?
The original, or one version of the Hodgkin-Huxley equation is that n is probabilistic, and it's probabilistic at the level of the individual channel. But if you have many channels, and they're all probabilistic in the same way, and they all linearly contribute to the conductance of the cell, you can, in many cases, you can ignore the probabilistic nature of these conductances and just consider the average. And these equations are the equations of the average. Maybe I should say something, a few more words about the stochasticity. At the level of individual channels are basically large molecules. And when channels open and close, when ionic channels open and close, the microscopic or the physical correlate of what we call open and closed channels are changes in the conformation of these very large molecules. And these changes are stochastic in nature. Stochastic in the deep sense that they are governed by quantum mechanics. Now, if you have a small number of such channels, then this stochasticity could be of importance to the function of the cell. If you have many such channels, you don't care about the stochasticity, you just care about the average behavior. And whether or not this stochasticity is important or not, this is a question of debate. It depends to a large extent on what system you are studying and what question you are studying. Obviously, it's more complicated to study the stochastic dynamics, so in this course we will focus on the deterministic part of the dynamics and the average behavior. Any more questions?
So we generated the equation for the average of n?
This is, n is already the average, and this corresponds to the macroscopic phenomenon that corresponds to the fraction of open or closed channels throughout the membrane of the cell.
Is it the gate or the channel which is the four combined together?
I'm sorry?
The N stands for, if one channel composed of 4 gates, so N stands for gate or channel?
I'm sorry, I do not understand the question. This is, you ask why it's n to the power of 4?
No, I'm saying what does N stand for if we know that there are gates and channels, and you say that N stands for the entire channel. Doesn't it stand for the gate open?
So for the purpose of this the way that I'm presenting this model, basically what you have, you're interested in the fraction of open gates in the population, and for each channel to be open, you need four of these gates.
So this is
to be
N4.
four of these gates to be open. That's why you have n to the power of 4.
Yeah.
And basically n to the power of 4 corresponds to the fraction in the population of channels, the fraction of open channels.
Yeah,
In the
n to the
entire
power of
population.
4, yeah.
N to the power of 4, this term would be the fraction of open
Channels.
active potassium channels. Now let's look at these equations. So what do we learn from these equations? Let's say that the Merman potential is fixed. What do we expect to happen if the Merman potential is fixed? Let's say that Merman potential is fixed at minus 50 millivolts. I apologize that the units here are volts and second and not the more common units of millivolts and milliseconds. For some reason I couldn't find a nice figure, high quality figure of these parameters, but you in your homework assignment you would plot things yourself, so don't worry about it. So let's say that the Merman potential is fixed at minus 50 millivolts. What would we expect to happen to n? Again, Merman potential is fixed to minus 50 millivolts. It cannot change, it cannot move. We have an electrode inside the axon. We make sure that actually that the Merman potential is minus 50 millivolts. It will decay, n would decay kind of exponential to what?
What would be the
To which value will it decay?
to n infinity?
What n infinity? What's the value? So let's say that we keep the Merman potential at minus 50 millivolts. This is minus 0.05 volts. This means that the n infinity value is something like, let's say, 0.6. Would be this point. And from this equation we know that the dynamics would converge to n infinity. How fast would it take it to converge? It will converge, if the voltage is fixed, it will converge exponentially fast, and with exponent time, which is something like 4 or 5 milliseconds. Within 4 or 5 milliseconds, approximately, it will reach the value of 0.6. Let's say that the Merman potential is at the value of 0. What would happen? Well, n infinity is something like 0.8. So the dynamics would converge to 0.8. The dynamics of n would converge to approximately 0.8. How fast would it take it? Faster, which is something like 2 milliseconds. Okay, this is a way in which we can understand this equation. Questions about this equation? We still don't understand why we have an actual potential, but first I want you to understand these dynamic equations.
So we won't actually treat n as a
No, we're going to study the deterministic equations. More questions? We have so we understand the leak current, we understand the potassium current. What about the sodium current? Sodium current is slightly more complicated. It is gated by two variables. One is called M and one is called H. And the dynamics of M has a similar shape to the dynamics of N, and the dynamics of H has a similar shape to the dynamics of M. Both of them decay exponentially fast to, in the case of M, to M infinity, and in the case of H, to H infinity. And what we will do after the break, we will understand how these dynamics give rise to the action potential. So we take a 15-minute break now. Questions?
זה גם מתנהג ככה.
כן, כן, זה הכל מגיע...
לא אלה, כן? אלה. גם הם מתנהגים...
זה גם מגיע מאיזשהו first principle, to some extent, to first principle, וזה גם הכל נמדד. ונמדד בתאים שונים. עכשיו, תאים שונים יהיו פרמטרים טיפה שונים. אבל זה הפרמוס הזה, זה נמדד כן, כן, כל
לא, הגרפים זה מדדים. הם מדדו את זה ואז בנו משוואות כדי למה המשוואה מתארת ככה? הוא אומר לך, נכון, אין זה שערים של כאלה. הוא אומר, רק מסביר את הגרף, אם אני ב-0 וולט, ואני מחכה עכשיו מספיק זמן כדי שהשערים האלה יתעצבו על הרמה אצלה שלה, אז אין נניח יהיה פתוח אם אני מחכה ב-0 וולט, אוקיי, זה יהיה פתוח, זאת ההסתברות של השער, זה כמות השערים הפתוחים. ואז פה הוא אומר באיזו מהירות זה הולך לקרות. את המהירות של המספחים למסגרים גם... זאת אומרת שאם זה הפער של אז באפס, בוא נניח שאתה הולך לפתוח עם משוואה הספרנטלית הזאת, שזה כאילו משוואה שאתה... אנחנו יודעים לפתוח. בסופו של דבר יש שם איזשהו אקספוננט עם הטאו הזה, נכון? והטאו הזה אני צריך לראות אבל, אוקיי, באיזה V אני נמצא, כי טאו תלוי ב-V. אז לפי ה-V שאני נמצא בו, אני יודע אם זה יקרה מהר, לאט. זאת אומרת שאם אתה... לא, פשוט באפס זה יקרה יותר מהר. יותר קטן. כן. זה הזמן שיקח לו להתכנס לערך הזה.
טוב, אי אפשר לתת את זה אולי?
כן, זאת אומרת, אבל תחשוב שעכשיו אני נמצא בוולטג' אחר. עכשיו אני עושה סטאפ אתה עכשיו בכוח משנה את הוולטג' שאתה עכשיו עשיתי לו סטאפ אבל ייקח לו זמן להגיע לערך הזה לפתוח את כל העדים שלו. אז הזמן זה הזמן ככה, אני שבר כאילו כדי למצוא את טאו אין תחבורה שהכל אפשר רק לפי ואין שותפות שזה א' לפי השני הצדדים בכל זאת נקרא אני חושב שמה ככל שיש יותר ככל שיש יותר וולט הזמן לפתוח יותר קטן ככל שאתה מכניס יותר וולט אבל נכון אני מניח הזמן זה מה שקוביקייט וגם הפוך אם אני נותן דיסקרט וולט אז לוקח לו הרבה זמן אני מקבל את השינוי שלו זאת אומרת, שני אלה הם לא מגיעים לפתרון שני הגרפים האלה.
לא, הגרפים האלה זה האינפוט המשוואות הדיפרנציאליות. זה מייצג את אין אינסוף.
אוקיי.
הגודל אין אינסוף, אין אינסוף.
זה הערכים שמדדו פשוט.
אני חושב שזה באמצע אני מפסיק לעבוד. אני לא טועה.
אוקיי? נניח בוולטג' 0, את השבר היחסי של השערים הפתוחים, מסך כל השערים הפתוחים.
איך אתה עושה את זה?
איך בכלל, א' איך בכלל מודדים את זה? אם זה משהו שנמדד.
זה אפשר למדוד לפי הזרם, לא? לפי הזרם שאני צריך להכניס לו כדי לשמור על המתח קבוע.
לא, אבל אופטים וקס לא ידעו בכלל שיש שערים.
בוא נגיד שאתה חיים קיבלו פרס נובל, לא סתם. בוא נניח שאתה יודע את המשוואות האלה. אוקיי? אתה יכול לחשב את ה... אתה יכול להעריך נומרית את הדבר הזה, בגלל שאתה מחזיק את התא מינוס 40, מינוס 50, אתה מחזיק את התא במתחים שונים, אתה בודק את הזרמים שונים. אתה יכול לחסום נגיד תעלות סודיום, לחסום תעלות פוטסיום ולהישאר רק עם הרכיב של סודיום ופוטסיום. עכשיו, בעצם הפונקציות האלה יש להם צורה מסוימת. זה בעצם בולטזמן דיסטריביושן כזה. ולכן, עכשיו אתה מודד אמפירית, אתה לא תקבל את זה. אתה תקבל את זה בחזקה מסוימת. אתה תשים לב שכדי להתאים את הדאטה הנומרי למה שמדדת, אתה תפתח חזקה 3 או חזקה 4 או חזקה 1.
זאת אומרת שהנושא במשוואות האלה ניסו להתקיים?
לא.
כי אם אני חושב נכון, אז צריך קודם למדוד ואז להציג את המשוואה הזאת, לא? אם לא יודעים כלום על המכנים שלי.
לא הבנתי את השאלה.
אתה אומר שהם מדדו?
כן.
טוב, אני לא יודע, אני אעשה כלום מחדש.
מה שראינו מדדו קודם, ואז מתוך זה הגיעו להשערה של מה המשוואה, או שהם הסתכלו על המנגנון, ואז בנו מודל וראו שמתאים למדידה.
אני לא יודע. אני חושב שהם עשו את זה ביחד. עבדו על המנגנונים חלופיים, אנשים דיברו על כל מיני אפשרויות. המנגנון הזה אפשר להבין אותו גם, בעצם כל תעלה יכולה להיות פתוחה או סגורה באיזשהו סיכוי מסוים. מזה אתה מקבל את הבולטזמן דיסטריביושן של התעלה, ומזה אתה מקבל את הפונקציה הזאת. עכשיו, הרוחב שלה בעצם תלוי ב-energy gap בין מצב פתוח למצב סגור. וה-energy gap קובע את הרוחב הזה. השאלה אם הפונקציה הולכת ככה או הולכת ככה, תלוי בשאלה איפה האנרגיה יותר נמוכה, במצב פתוח ובמצב סגור. עכשיו, החזקה מגיעה מזה, מהשאלה של כמה בעצם, אתה יכול לחשוב שתעלה דורשת 4 גייט, ומה הסיכוי שכולם יהיו פתוחים. עכשיו, מתוך המשוואות האלה אתה גם מקבל את טאו. זאת אומרת, טאו ו-N הם לא בלתי תלויים, זה פרמטרים שקשורים אחד לשני.
יונתן,
כן.
טאו N נניח, נכון אני בעבור, אם אני מקבע את המתח, אני מקבל שיש לו איזשהו טיים, הוא ביחידות של זמן, יש לו איזה פרק זמן נוסף. לא הבנתי בדיוק איך זה מתחבר אבל לכמות, לתעלות הפתוחות. כאילו, מה זה אומר? זה כאילו נדבר על תעלה היחידה, לא נדבר על סך כל היחיד, על כל התעלות, נכון? טאו N הוא
אני רוצה לקחתי משהו לשתות, טוב, תשאל.
לא, אני יכול לדבר.
אוקיי. Okay, so in the previous hour, I um, I described, I wrote down the Hodgkin-Huxley equations, and I will try and give you an intuition to why these equations give rise to action potentials. And what we will do next, we will study a simplified version of these equations to gain an analytical insight to what's going on here. So, at resting potential, let's say minus 70 millivolts, let's say that we keep the cell at minus 70 millivolts. Under these conditions, the M, this is the black line, and the N variables are rather small. On the other hand, the H variable is open, is large. Okay? Let's say that we fix the memory potential at minus 70 or minus 80, then M and N will be small and H will be large. What would be the consequences? So this if N is small, then this conductance, this potassium conductance is pretty small. So the contribution of this term would be relatively small. What happened? What about the sodium current? So if we keep the cell at minus 70 or minus 80, it is true that H is close to 1. But M, this term M, the black line, is close to 0. So the product is close to 0, so the contribution of this term would also be very small. So basically, when the cell is kept at minus 70 or minus 80 millivolts, these two conductances, the potassium conductance and the sodium conductance, these conductances are very small, and as a result, what dominates the dynamics of the Merman potential is this Lie current. So if the cell is close to, let's say, minus 70 or minus 80, its behavior, its response to inputs is similar to the response of the passive RC circuit. Questions about that? So the cell is approximately behaves like a passive RC circuit around its resting potential minus 70 or minus 80. Now let's say that we take a cell that spends a long period of time in this minus 70 millivolts, and we change its membrane potential to, let's say, minus 40 millivolts. What would happen? So the fastest dynamic variable here is M. Excuse me? So if we take this neuron and move it from minus 70 to minus 40 or minus 30, the M that was previously in a state that was close to 0 will move to a state that is open. And this would take less than 1 millisecond. This would be a very fast process. So what would happen if M goes from 0 to 1? What would happen if M goes from 0 to 1? What would be the effect on the currents going into the cell, the conductances? So let's look at, so M affects the sodium current, and the sodium current is proportional to M to the third times H. Now, H, when the cell was in minus 70, H was approximately equal to 1. So when M moves from 0 to 1, suddenly this conductance becomes important, because very, very fast, less than 1 millisecond, this M goes from 0 to 1. This product goes from 0 to 1, and sodium conductances become important in the dynamics of the cell. What would be the effect of increase in sodium conductance on the Merman potential of a cell? It's a depolarizing current. So if we open these sodium channels, the cell would be depolarized. What would be the effect of depolarization of the cell on these currents? So if we move, for example, from minus 50 to minus 40 to minus 30, what would happen?
The voltage would decrease, the membrane voltage.
So what would happen if we look at the M term? The M term would further open, would further increase. And when the M term further increases, the sodium current further increases. And when the sodium current further increases, the cell depolarizes. And if the cell depolarizes, M further increases. And this would, within a very short period of time, within less than a millisecond, this conductance would become the dominant conductance, and the Merman potential would move to the reversal potential of sodium. So this is something that is very fast. So this is how a cell can go from minus 70 to, let's say, plus 40 within 1 millisecond. Okay, so the cell is now is depolarized at a value that is determined by the reversal potential of the sodium battery. What would happen next? So now we have there are two more dynamic variables in this system. One is N and one is H. And the time scale is approximately the same time scale. They are much slower than the M. The N is when the cell is in a depolarized state, the time scale is both approximately 1, 2, 3, well, approximately 2 milliseconds. So what would be the effect? So one thing is, let's look at H. H was previously open because the cell was in a high polarized state. When the cell moved to a depolarized state, the H closes. So the sodium conductance now would decrease as a result of the cell being in a depolarized state. So M is open, but now H will close. This is one thing that would happen. What would happen to N? N that was previously closed would open, increasing the conductance of potassium. So you decrease the conductance of sodium and increase the conductance of potassium. What would be the consequences? Hyperpolarization. So less sodium and more potassium. So the sequence is as follows. You depolarize the cell. Very quickly, you have a lot of sodium conductance, which depolarizes the cell, which starts a positive feedback loop until the cell approaches the reversal potential of the sodium. This conductance becomes dominant. And then sodium conductance goes down, potassium conductance goes up, and the cell goes back to a high polarizing state. So this is how it looks in simulation. So the cell, you depolarize the cell. There is an increase in the sodium conductance. As a result of this increase in the sodium conductance, there is an increase in the membrane potential. An increase in the membrane potential results in a further increase in the sodium conductance. You have a positive feedback that ends when the cell is close to the sodium reversal potential, and then sodium channels start to close and potassium channels start to open, resulting in a hyperpolarization of the cell. So this is the mechanism. This is the mechanism underlying the action potential. And now I think you can answer the question: how come that the time scale of an action potential is on the order of 1 millisecond, where the characteristic time scale of the passive membrane of a neuron is on the order of 10 or 100 milliseconds? So what's the solution to this puzzle? I'm sorry? Yeah, but how come that the time scale of the membrane? How come that the membrane allows for events that are so short in time, given that its characteristic time scale is substantially longer?
The membrane changes.
What changes in the membrane?
The channels.
How changes in the channels change the time scale?
The channels themselves change, and then the conductance changes, and then the whole
So the point here is that there are changes in the conductance. There's a huge increase in the conductance of the membrane potential. And remember that characteristic time scale of a membrane is a product of resistance times the capacitance. So if you increase conductance by a factor of 10 or by a factor of 100, you decrease the characteristic time scale by a factor of 10 or factor of 100, allowing for these very short events, much shorter than the characteristic time scale of a membrane, under its passive, under the characteristic time scale of the passive membrane when the sodium and potassium channels are closed. So again, in the process of an action potential, there is a large increase in sodium and potassium conductances, allowing for much faster events than are allowed when in the passive state of the membrane, where these conductances are closed and the time scale is substantially longer. Any questions about the action potential? So these equations are kind of complicated, and you'll be able to play with them and see how action potentials are generated using numerical simulations in your homework assignment. And what we will do now, we will study a simplified version of the Hodgkin-Huxley model. And again, with two goals. One is to better understand what is an action potential, what's a threshold, what's the meaning of this threshold property. And the second is to learn tools that will enable us later to study the nonlinear dynamics of networks. And the model that we will discuss is a model that is called the Fitsu-Nagumo model. This model was developed by this guy, Richard Fitsu, and it was simulated using hardware by a Japanese guy called Nagumo. Now, I couldn't find Nagumo's picture in the internet. All I could find is this original circuit that simulated these equations that were put forward by Fitsu. So this is so what we will study today the Fitsu-Nagumo model. Questions? And now we will go back to the whiteboard. Okay, so in the original Hodgkin-Huxley equations, how many dynamic variables did we have? 4. If I can count. So we had the membrane potential, M, H, and N. So in the original Hodgkin-Huxley equation, the dynamics was characterized by 4 degrees of freedom, or 4 variables. And the Fitsu-Nagumo is a simpler model that is characterized by 2 degrees of freedom. So we have the potential. We have a variable that we'll call V, and we'll think about this variable as a kind of a Merman potential. This would be a fast variable. And it would correspond to the fast variables. This would be V and M in the original Hodgkin-Huxley equations. So we have 2 degrees of freedom. One is a fast degree of freedom, which we think about it as a combined version of the Merman potential and the sodium activation term M. And we will have a slow variable, which we denote by W, which is kind of a recovery term. This would be slow variable that would represent the N and H in the original Hodgkin-Huxley equations. Okay, so we will have, rather than working in a complicated 4-dimensional world that is difficult to understand and difficult to analyze, we would simplify these equations and study a model that is characterized just by two dynamic variables. And I will write I'll write down the equations that characterize the model. So the first equation is equation that characterizes the fast dynamics, the dynamics of the moment potential. And this dynamics, according to this dynamics change, dv dt is equal to some function v that I will write in a second, minus w plus this external input. So this is the first equation for the moment potential, where f of v is equal to v 1 minus v minus a between 0 and 1. It's a cubic. It's a third degree polynomial. It's a cubic function. And the second equation, the equation for the recovery term, would be equal to some variable b times v minus gamma w. We'll take gamma to be between 0 and 1. And we will consider the case that b is much smaller than 1. What's the meaning that b is much smaller than 1? What's the interpretation of b being much smaller than 1? W changes slowly, so this is just another way of saying that w is a slow variable. And at some point, we will take the limit of b goes to 0. But we will not worry about it for the time being. So we have two dynamic equations that characterize that in some sense it will become clear. It will become clear later. These two equations approximate the Hodgkin-Huxley equations. Now, our goal would be to try and understand this model, try and understand the properties of this model. Superficially, it's not very easy because the dynamics is nonlinear. We have a nonlinear term here. It's not one-dimensional. It's already 2 dimensions. V can be negative, yes. B? No. B is a positive number. B is positive. Thank you for your comment. So the way to think about these equations, and we will be more precise later. We have V depends on V. You remember that the sodium current, the magnitude of the sodium current, dependent on the voltage, and the sodium current determined this is a term that corresponds to the interaction of the voltage with itself. The fact that the more sodium current you have, the larger the voltage is, and the amount of voltage current depends on the total amount of voltage. Just a second. This term corresponds to the effect, for example, of the potassium. How the more potassium you have, the more dv dt is negative. And this term, this is a slow term that tells us how this recovery term or this potassium term depends on the moment potential and on itself. It increases with the moment potential and decreases with its own value. You had a question.
So we assume that concentration does not change. Is it really true in the brain as well?
concentrations of.
different ions, because we only talk about voltages, which change the.
You assume the battery is constant.
Okay, so this is. I think that I answered this question in last week. The question is, does the activity in the brain change the concentration of different ions? And we should address it in two ways. We should ask, does it change the concentrations of ions within a cell, the internal part, and between cells, the external matrix? And in talking about within a cell, there are different ionic pumps and different mechanisms that make sure that the concentrations within the cell remain approximately constant. And these are active processes that take energy. This is within a cell, and in the external matrix, it is generally believed that the concentrations are approximately constant. There are some cases, I think that there's a case with hair cells in the auditory system that actually there are changes. They can change, but in general, in most cases, in most models, one would assume that they don't. And this is approximately true. In action, when you have activity, that most ions don't, definitely not sodium and potassium, the concentrations don't change much, and there ain't much movement of ions in and out. The actual number of ions that change, that go inside or outside, the actual number is pretty small. And you also have to remember that the dependence of the battery on the concentrations is logarithmic. So the dependence is weak. You need to work hard in order to make a change in the battery. You had a question?
To know why we determine f of b to be like that. The term of f of b.
This will become later. This will become clear later. More questions? Okay, so this is a model. And now we forget about the biology and we go to math and ask the question of, okay, we have this model. How does this model behave? This is our question. And in order to address this question of how does this model behave, we start with a simplified case, just for the sake of argument, and in order to learn the tools required to analyze this dynamics. I'm going to start with the simplest case. Simplest case is I is equal to 0, B is equal to 0, and the initial conditions for W are equal to 0. Now this obviously simplifies this model, and all we are left with is study this dynamics. dV dt is equal to V, 1 minus V, V minus A. So what's the next step in analyzing such an equation? So there are two approaches. One approach is to say, well, we studied the course in differential equations. Let's dive in and solve this equation analytically. In the more general case, this may be difficult to impossible. And what we typically do when we see such equation is the first thing that we try to figure out is what are the fixed points of the dynamics. So the fixed point of the dynamics What's a fixed point of the dynamics? This is the value of V such that dV dt is equal to 0. And what are the fixed points of this dynamics? That's easy. Okay, so in this case, first fixed point is equal to 0, second fixed point is equal to A, and third fixed point is equal to 1. What's the next step? Stability. So next thing that we do when analyzing such equation is to study the local stability. What does it mean, locally stable fixed point?
That the derivative both when you go outside of the stability point will point to the direction of the point.
What means that it's local? So a locally stable fixed point is that in some sense there is a region around this point such that the dynamics when t goes to infinity approaches the fixed point. In that case, we would say that there are various, in the literature, people talk about different notions of stability. There is a Lyapunov stability, and there is an attracting fixed point. We will use these terms in an imprecise way. But the idea is that we ask the question whether, if we start near the fixed point, whether the dynamics would converge, whether the dynamics as t goes to infinity would converge to this fixed point. And if we find that as t goes to infinity, the dynamics starting from a region near the fixed point, if we find that the dynamics converges to the fixed point, we would say that that this fixed point is attractive, or we would say that this fixed point is stable. This is local stability. What do we mean when we talk about global stability? What's a globally stable fixed point? Or globally attractive fixed point? No matter where you are, the dynamics when t goes to infinity would converge to the fixed point. So this is the meaning of a globally stable fixed point. And one way of finding out whether these fixed points are stable or are unstable, whether they are attractive or repulsive, we can address this question geometrically without doing any calculations by computing, or by drawing more precisely. I'm going to draw dV dt as a function of v. So how does it look? What happens when v is very negative? So this is negative, positive, negative. So when v is very negative, dV dt is very positive. Let's say we're here. Okay, let's perhaps I should start by drawing the fixed points. There's one fixed point here at 0. There's another fixed point here at A, and there's another fixed point here at 1. Right? And we know that when v is very negative, dV dt is very positive. What happens when v is very positive? V is very positive, very large. This is positive. This is negative. This is positive. So it would be somewhere here. And in between, there is the curve dvdt crosses the zero line in 3 points, in the 3 fixed points. So it looks something like this. Right? Any questions about that? Is it clear what I'm doing? Should I go faster? Everyone knows this? Okay, so how do we determine the stability of the fixed points from this geometric, from this phase portrait, or from this geometric representation of the problem?
We draw the vector orientation if the function is above zero negative.
So the idea is to look at what would be the dynamics of V, or the trajectory at different points. So let's say that we are in a very negative region, in this region. This region, dvdt is positive, and as a result, the dynamics would flow in the positive region, in the positive direction. dvdt would increase. What happens if V is very large? The dynamics would, dvdt would be negative, and as a result, the dynamics would flow in the negative direction, so it would go in this direction. What about this region? In this region, dvdt is positive, so dynamics would move to the right, and in this region, the dvdt is negative, and dynamics would move to the left. And as a result, we know that if we start from left to this point, dynamics would go right, and if we start right to this point, dynamics would go left. So this is a stable fixed point. Similarly, if we start from right to the right of this point, dynamics would go in the negative direction. If we start to the left of this point, dynamics would go in the right direction. So starting near this fixed point, dynamics would converge to this fixed point. So these 2 points are a stable fixed point, and this point is an unstable fixed point. So this is easy. Questions about this? There's another way of doing it in a more formal way, and I will do it formally because we will need it. We will need it later in the more complicated cases. So how do we solve this question more formally, whether a fixed point is stable or unstable? So the idea is if V star, this is the standard way of this is a standard notation for a fixed point. So we assume that our initial conditions are equal to the fixed point plus some small perturbation, such that this small perturbation is in some sense is sufficiently small. And we consider the dynamics, this dvdt is equal to f of v. So what should we do next? What can we do, assuming that delta v is very small? We can linearize this. We can linearize this function f of v, or we can Taylor expand this function f of v around the stable fixed point. So this would be equal to f of v plus df of v at this point times delta v plus half d square f v squared times delta v squared plus and so on. And what's the value of f of v star? This is 0 because we said that v is a fixed point. Yeah.
What do you do now?
I'm Taylor expanding this function around v star. Just a Taylor expansion. And since v star is a fixed point, then f of v is equal to 0. It's a fixed point. That's the whole idea. And this term, in general, if delta v is small enough, this term would be smaller than this term. If this term is non-zero, if the f dv is non-zero for a sufficiently small delta v, this term would be larger than this term. So this would be, you can write d dt of delta v to be approximately equal to df dv at the fixed point times delta v, right?
Can you explain why v0 equals to what you wrote initially? The first one.
This?
No, above it.
This?
No, the first one, above it.
This?
To the left? Yeah.
Well, I can always do that. I'm measuring v relative to v star. This is the definition of delta v.
So what is delta v again? Sorry.
Delta v is how far away am I from the fixed point. So
It's not a delta function.
oh, no. It's also delta, but it's not the delta. It's not a Dirac delta function. So this is just equal to some lambda times delta v, where lambda is equal to df dv at a fixed point. So what's the solution to this equation? ddt, I'm sorry? It's an exponential. So the solution is just delta v is equal to delta v0 e to the lambda t. So what determines the stability of the fixed point? So what determines the stability of the fixed point is just a sign of lambda. If lambda is smaller than 0, this means that the fixed point is stable. And if lambda is positive, this implies that it's unstable. So now we can go to this equation. I deleted the only thing that I should not have deleted, which is a function of f of v. I'll write it again. F of v is equal to v, y minus v, v minus a. So the derivative of v is equal to 1 minus v, v minus a, minus v, v minus a, plus v, 1 minus v. So at the fixed point, f prime of v being equal to 0 is just equal to minus a, and f prime of v being equal to a will be just equal to a1 minus a. And the derivative of f at the third fixed point is just equal to minus 1 minus a, right? That's easy. I'm computing this lambda term for the three fixed points by taking the derivative of this f of v and plugging in the fixed point, and the trivial result is that that these two fixed points are stable, whereas this fixed point is unstable. Questions about this? Yes.
From the previous about f of v in the
Fitsunagumo.
yes. What is the meaning of the function again in the model? The f of v. We have this capital. What is f of v?
Well, this is f of v. So ask about the interpretation of this function. Okay, the idea in okay, the idea in the Fitsunagumo model, or the way that it's related to the Hodgkin-Huxley or to the sodium conductances in the Hodgkin-Huxley model, is that if you make a small perturbations in the membrane potential, it will converge to the zero membrane potential. But if you make large perturbations to the membrane potential, large meaning larger than A, you have a positive feedback that is driven by this polynomial. There's a positive feedback that drives you to 1. So somebody asked me, why are we using a cubic function? What's the interpretation of the cubic function? And this cubic function has this property that for small perturbations, you go back to the zero fixed point. If you start from 0 for small perturbation, you go to the 0 fixed point, whereas for large perturbations, you start a positive feedback process that would actually increase the potential. And this is similar to the idea of the sodium conductances in the Hodgkin-Huxley equation. If you make a small perturbation to the membrane potential, it doesn't have a large effect on the sodium conductances, and the dynamics reverts back to the resting membrane potential. But if you make a large enough perturbation, then this positive feedback, in the case of Hodgkin-Huxley, this is the dependence of the opening of the sodium conductances on the membrane potential. In the case of the Fitsunagumo, this is just a cubic dependence of dVdt on V. You start a positive feedback process, and what would end this positive feedback process would be the other recovery slow variable.
So if it would depend only on this, it would stay on this value 1.
Yes, yes. And how this works, we will see next week. Questions? So see you next week.
גם, כאילו, הבאת, שאלתי אותם מה זה את הרעש לבן הזה, אז גם, אני פשוט הבאת ביטוי אנליטי, עכשיו, פעם, כאילו, אז השאלה שלי הייתה, איך אתה מודד את הרעש לבן, לא יודע אם מה שבחרת
אתה יכול להגיד
טוב.
שה-B
במה אתה
שמקבל זה כבר רעש נגיד לא לבן.
כל הפרק של הפונקציות האחרונות.
לא אני לא מבין את השאלה שלך. אתה שואל איך אני עושה סימולציה שלו?
אתה תראה את הרעש לבן, אני שואל, איך אתה רושם את זה כנראה יש כך שאתה רוצה להכניס את זה במחשב, אז אתה לקחת ביטוי אנליטי, פשוט אמרת אוקיי, זה פונקציה דלתא.
טכניקות
אני
וזה,
שואל
אתה יכול
אם זה
לבחון
טוב, לא
פונקציות
טוב, לא טוב,
זה ההגדרה שלו.
תרשמו לי, זה כזה שבוע,
זה ההגדרה שלו.
אתה יודע, זה שני
מה
תרגילים.
שתיארתי זה הגדרה של רעש לבן, אני לא יכול לצייר רעש לבן, במובן זה שאם אני מצייר רעש לבן, הייתי מקבל סיגנל שהוא אינסופי.
יש פתרון, דברים כאלה, יש פתרון.
תסתכל מה הווריאנט של רעש לבן. הווריאנט של רעש לבן
יש טכניקות כאלה שמשתמשים
נגיד מה שנקרא סיגמה בריבוע תאו כפול דלתא של אפס, דלתא של אפס אינסופי. זה סיגנל שהווריאנט שלו המובן הזה הוא לא דבר שקיים, זה גבול. רעש לבן זה גבול.
ואז כל מיני מערכות
כן, זה גבול. כמו של דלתא זה פונקציה של לא יודע. כאילו כל השיעור וקטור לא מוחלטים. בטוח לא. לא. לא מתחייב על הקיום, לא מתחייב על הזמן. בעיקרון מה שזה שעה יתר כן, גם לא מתחייב שתמיד התרגול יהיה בשעה הזאת. שיעור על השעה הזאת זה אני לא מתחייב. אבל דברים בעיקרון מוחלטים שאתה אמרו לי שהיה מה קורה עם ההקלטות של השיעור? כן, אתה דואג לצורך עליו מה זה היה?
אם בחר בכלליות יש משהו סיכוי להזיז אותה, כאילו, בגלל שזה סופרים יום ראשון, אז שזה כאילו דווקא, זאת אומרת, חצי 3 שעות לפני, כן, כאילו לא כל שלום, שני חשיר
נועד כדי לעזור לסתם
עכשיו הוא אומר ככה, תבדוק כיתה, תמיד תעבור פה עכשיו פרופסור, אבל עכשיו הוא לא ילך לסתור. זה לא משהו שאתה לא יכול לדעת. אבל הוא עושה ככה, הוא הולך לכיתה היה לו כל מיני דברים
Yeah, and you want to cut it down, then you have another segment and you want to put this in. So say this is like, can't remember
But to these, and then I have this sequence, and to this sequence I can add some more base pairs, which code for these. So once I copy this, I'll get something that ends with these, and then it exists here. Understand what I'm saying?
The restriction is the complementary sequence. How you what? Sorry, I'm just confused.
Now, say this is like, now this looks like something like this. Whatever, I can't remember. Something, well, something like this. So you want this part to end with this.
So that so you get the overlap.
Yeah, so when you put it next to this goes next to this.
Complementary.
So the idea is just to, so this is your primer that fits as the gist types here. So you want something like this. And then to this you just add like a bunch of stuff.
You add the complementary strand to the overhanging strand here.
Yeah.
To the primer on your PCR.
Yeah, and this is the complement we want to use it for this.
Right.
Which
So
is like,
but your primer starts here, right?
yeah, your no, I mean this, the whole thing is called the primer. But so you do
But
this
this
based
is
on
the
this.
primer, isn't actually complementary to.
Yeah, it's not complementary here,
Alright, you
but
just
once you
edit
copy
it.
it, it'll be
So that's
complementary here.
alright.
So that's like the whole, I mean that's the advantage of using the PCR, so that you can engineer your
You can just do that.
inserts
So
to,
right as you're doing the PCR, instead of adding the primer, which is already quite complementary with the bit that you're
so
actually
I mean
trying to
this will
copy.
complement like here,
Uh-huh.
and this will overhang, but once you
But this you can already add to your primer.
yeah,
You can do your primer to this thing, and then it only starts doing
yeah.
the work, but it will still match with.
the door. Thanks. So first of all, about the exercise, I got many questions. Now that's okay. You need to. I think if the exercises takes you time, or if it's too hard, I think it's fine. But if you are frustrated because a mistake in the exercise, or just because you don't know what to do, please send me emails. Now, I prefer that you'll put everything, you'll ask questions in the Moodle. And this is first because other people can answer before me, because I'm checking it like once a day. And second, because if I'm answering, I would like that everyone will see the answer. Because usually people ask the same questions. So it will be better for you to ask questions in the Moodle, in the forum, student forum, and not send me emails. But you can still send me email if you think that your question is so stupid and you don't want anything that other people will think that you are stupid. So, and you're not. So that's fine. And so if you have any questions about the exercise, something which is really, really important, you can ask now. Otherwise, you can come in the break and ask me. I'm really a fan of books. I know that usually when you're doing a course, you don't have time to read the books. But I really recommend that you read them maybe later, if you have time, if you want, I don't know what. The course has not, Yonatan is not following a specific book. There's not a specific book that is good enough for this course, but there are several books which are quite nice, I think. So every time we start a new subject or something like this, I'll tell you what are the relevant books, and I'll put them also in the Moodle. So the first one is Strogatz. It's nonlinear dynamics and chaos. It's what Yonatan started to do today with the Fitch-Nagumo model. This is an excellent book. It's very easy to read. Its level is not that high, but still it gets most of the stuff that you need in nonlinear dynamics. I'm not sure we'll have time to do chaos in this course, but maybe we'll do. So the first part of this book is very good. The second one is Izekevich. It's Dynamical Systems in Neuroscience. It has stuff like the Fitch-Nagumo, like if you felt that Yonatan went very fast on Hodgkin-Huxley. So it's there. It's written very nicely with figures and everything. So it's also a nice book that you can read. So I recommend you to look at it. So the lectures are recorded, and Nir over here is uploading to the YouTube. I'll put also a link on the website so you can see where you can look. You can see me and Yonatan even at 12 o'clock. So
now they have the mic on.
So if you have the microphone, you can hear. If you have a bad laptop, you cannot hear. So put the headphones or something. And if you cannot hear, so this is Neil's fault. Okay. Any other questions regarding the exercise or something like this? Okay, good. So what we'll do today is going to help you in your exercise is, if you remember last week, we talked about the Euler method to simulate ordinary differential equation. Now we'll talk about stochastic differential equation. So we would like to simulate stochastic differential equation. It's called SDE. And for this, we'll use the Euler Maruyama. So no one knows it, I think, because no one uses it. So it's just the Euler method for SDE. So it's Euler Maruyama method. I don't know if you would like to look at it in Google. So let me remind you what we did last week. We talked about ODE, ordinary differential equations. These are deterministic equations. The equation was dy dt is equal to f of y and t, where you need also the initial condition, y of t equals 0 is equal to y0. This is a deterministic equation. If I know this and I know the function, I know I know what is the function at every time point. At least I know to simulate it numerically. And the way we used to and what we did and what you also did in your exercise is to simulate it numerically using the Euler method. So we simulated with Euler method, and the equation was yn is equal to yn minus 1 plus f of yn minus 1 t of n minus 1 times delta t, right? Delta t is equal to our h in last week, okay? Okay, and what we are going to do this hour is to see how we simulate stochastic differential equation. So stochastic differential equation is very similar. It's dy dt is equal to the deterministic part, f of y and t, plus a noise term, which is eta t. So this is a random variable which changes in time. Also here I need to give you the initial condition y0, and I also need to tell you something about this stochastic variable. So I need to tell you first. What?
How it distributes.
So not all the PDF, I just need, and we'll see how we simulate it later, but there are two things that we need to know. First of all is the expectation value, which is 0, and second of all, the correlation function, which is a delta function. Okay, so this is Dirac's delta function. And this defines this stochastic differential equation.
Sigma?
What?
Before the delta?
This is sigma. If you don't understand something or I'm too fast, tell me.
And is it
Sigma squared.
sigma squared?
Okay?
This is for Gaussian, right?
So eta is taken from Gaussian distribution. We'll see what does it mean now, okay? So eta is white noise. That's what Jonathan showed you in the...
But it's not taken from Gaussian noise.
So we'll see how we simulate it, okay?
This stands for the expectant of eta, right? And
What?
the first term. Not the first.
Yes?
So it stands for the expectation.
Yes, so let me go first for this question. So for your question, it's very... So it's a Gaussian distribution, but it's very weird distribution because the variance at t equal t prime is infinity, right? So it's sigma squared times infinity. So this white noise is a term which is a little bit weird, but let's continue and you'll see, Jonathan already talked about it, but you'll see in the simulation, you'll get some hunch about what does it mean, okay? And before I'm going to your questions, so like we had in the ordinary differential equations, we would like to now to simulate this SDE, and this is what we're going to do now, right? To see how we simulate a stochastic differential equation. Okay, regarding your question, so I know that people which, if you don't have strong background in statistics or probability, then you are not really familiar with what is this notation, or what is which is the expectation value of eta of t, and what does it mean expectation value, and what does it mean expectation value of stochastic process, and what does it mean expectation value of multidimensional variables, right? So this is, if you only knew what is p of x, which is just one dimension, what is the joint probability? Maybe you're of two variables. Maybe you don't really know what this means. So next week on the extra hour that I'm giving, I'll talk about probability a little bit. Okay, so joint probabilities, I'll talk about expectation value, variance, and so on. So if you are not that strong in this, please come next week to the extra hour. Okay, so if I'm writing this bracket, I mean expectation value. Okay, that's the notation.
Is it the special case that it is 0 and not constant?
So if it's constant, we can take it to here. We'll see examples maybe in the exercise. Okay. So how do we simulate it? Before this, let's take two simple cases. The first simple cases is what happens if eta t is equal to 0 for all t. Okay, this is not really interesting. What?
In probability 1, because it's a variable. Theta of t is variable.
Right.
I mean, like
So
the probability 1 is equal to 0.
right?
That's what you said.
Yes, in different words. But I can also think about just as 0. I can take here some constant before and just take this constant to be 0. Okay? But for us, being not rigorous, eta t is 0 for all t. Okay, this gives, if we're doing this, we're just going back to the deterministic equation. Deterministic equation. So we're just going back to the regular OD. Okay, we know how to solve this. What happens if we take now f of y and t to be 0? Okay, so we are left with this equation. dy dt is equal to eta t with what? That's right here. With y of t at time 0, which is equal to y0. And also 1 and 2. And this equation has different names. For instance, it's called diffusion equation or Wiener process. Not diffusion, diffusion process or Wiener process. Just that if you meet it later, you'll know what it means. And let's see how it looks like. So like we did last week, I'm taking an example, like we did the decay, use the decaying exponent. I'm taking this example to see how can we simulate this equation, because we know to do some stuff about this equation. So I'm looking at y of t, and at time t equals 0, we know that y is equal y0. And now I'm asking what happens at time t. So one realization of the process will give me something that looks like this. Another realization of the process, and then y at time t is this guy over here. Okay, capital T. Right? And another realization of the process, I'm starting from y0. Y0 is deterministic. I'm starting from y0. Another realization, just because the noise term is different every time I'm running this process, so it will look a little bit different. And then another process will look like this. Each kind of trajectory like this, so like this black one over here, let me finish right, so each one of these trajectories is called realization of the process. or it's sometimes called the sample pass of the process. Yes?
Since f is 0, then y only changes because of the noise, right?
Yes.
But since the average of the noise, or the expectation value of the noise is 0, then you should stay around the same level. So, I mean, on all the three
Trajectories.
yeah, that you drew, it seems like there's some drift, which is not really, I mean, you should stay more or less around the same straight horizontal line, shouldn't you?
Okay, we'll see it, okay? I agree with you. There is no drift, there is a diffusion, right? But let's forget about the word diffusion and we'll see it. So, we'll see it in a minute, okay? When we calculate the variance of this guy. So first of all, you see that there's no really point to talk about what happens in yt, because it's different every time, because eta t is random. Therefore, what we should like to know is, for example, what is the expectation value at time t. Okay, so I'm looking at time t, and I want to know what is the expectation value. Another question that we would like to ask is, for example, to know other statistics of these distributions, and this, for example, is the variance. So this is the variance. This is the variance at time t. What? Feel free to ask questions. If you are afraid from the English or something like this, just ask it in Hebrew and I'll translate, okay? Don't be shy.
What is the meaning in Hebrew? Realization of the process? להבין את התהליך?
Realization.
אתה לא כאילו משהו מוכן.
How do you call it?
Realize
I know.
what the process is?
No, so it's a trajectory. One trajectory like this, and you see it in the exercise that you do. One trajectory. This black one is called realization. One realization. All right, or one sample path. Okay, you see it in the exercise. Stuff over here, you'll get a better feeling when after you do the exercise, and then maybe next week we'll talk about it again. Okay. So this type of equation we can actually solve analytically. It's similar to what Jonathan did in class, in the lecture. So what is 3? This is 3. So let's solve it analytically and look at the variance and the expectation value. For this, I'm integrating this equation. So I'm integrating both sides. What will I get? I'll get y. So I'm doing integration between 0 to t. So integration between 0 to t of dy dt and integration of eta t dt. Okay, so this just gives me y at time t minus y at time 0, which is just y0. And here I'm getting just the integral of eta t prime. So y at time t is equal to y0 plus the integral of eta t. Okay, so I'll just integrate both sides. Okay, what is the expectation value of yt? So expectation value is linear, so I can take the expectation value of this expression and do the expectation value of the two terms. So it's the expectation value of y0 plus the expectation value of the second term.
Yeah, but now you need the RFJ.
Okay. But the first term, y0 is deterministic. Why? It's a number. It's 5. It's 10. Expectation value of a number is the number. So this is equal to y0 plus, okay, expectation value of an integral. We can just take the expectation value inside the integral. Just do linear operations. So this is just equal to y0 because this guy over here is 0, right? This is what we know about the expectation value of eta t. Okay, so the expectation value of y at time t is equal to y0. Now what about the variance? So I would like to know what is the variance of y of t. The variance is just y at time t minus the average or the expectation value of yt, and I'm taking the square and again the expectation value.
Sorry.
Yes?
The expected value.
Expected?
Yeah.
Okay.
Expected value of a function.
Expected value. Thank you for the English correction. Okay, so I'm just taking the mean and I'm taking the expected value of the this square term. Okay. Now this guy we know what it is. It's just y0, right? And y of t we have it from here. So therefore y of t minus y0 is just the integral of eta t, and we need to take the square of this guy. Okay, now how do we take a square of an integral? So for this we just do two integrals, right? And if it was a summation, how we take the square of the summation? And just taking double summation over I and j of f of xi, f of xj. So I have the square of the integral. So I'm writing double integral of eta t prime eta t double prime and now again I'm inserting the expected value inside the integral. And now we know that this value here, right, I gave you at the beginning, is just the delta function. So this value here is just, or this value here is just the sigma square times delta t minus t prime minus t double prime. Okay, so it means that we have an integral from 0 to t. This guy is just 1, because I'm doing the integral on the delta function. So I'm getting the integral of 1 dt double prime times sigma squared that comes from here. And I'm getting sigma squared times t. So the variance of y of t is just sigma squared times t.
How do we know that it's equal to sigma squared delta?
That's what?
T prime. Yeah, how do we know that?
This I gave you in when I defined what is stochastic differential equation. I told you what is eta, that the expected value of eta t is 0, and eta t prime is delta. Okay. Any question about why is it sigma squared times t? Yes.
Where did the 1 came from? How did you know it's 1? The inner example.
So the delta function, I know that if I'm summing it over everything is 1, right? And now here what I have, so how will it look like? At 0, I have something that goes to infinity, and I'm summing over everything. So this is infinity, and this is minus infinity, and I'm getting 1, right? What's written here, now it doesn't matter if I sum from minus infinity to infinity, I can sum from here to here, right? I still get 1. If I just needed this part, it would be inside my summation. So this is exactly what happened there. I have t prime, which is from 0 to t, and the other t double prime, it's somewhere inside 0 to t. Okay? Think about it, and if you don't get it, come to me afterwards. Okay? Think about it. It's like 2 minutes to think about it. Okay. So as for your question, what's your name? Shmuel. So as for your question, the variance of y of t is not changing, and the expected value of y of t is not changing, but the variance is increasing with time. So this is why it's expanding with time. Okay, we'll see it again now. We'll see it, okay? Okay, now we would like to know how we simulate the stochastic differential equation. So in order to simulate it, we are doing what we did last time. We know that the time t equals 0, we are at y 0, right? And we would like to know what happens at time t. So this is one realization of the process. It looks like this. And what we are doing, we are just, to know what happens at time t, we just divide our interval 0 to t to small interval of size delta t, right? This is the h that we had last week. And how many, what is the number of interval we have in t, which is between 0 to t? T divided by delta t, right? This is the number of interval. Ah, wait. One problem of notation that I have with Jonathan. Okay, so let's before you kill me. So notation, consistency with notations of Jonathan. So Jonathan, he had this term, right? But he told you, I think, that you can just take this into sigma. So I'm just using sigma square. I'm forgetting tau core. And I'm using eta. This is what Jonathan called the current. You see it also in the exercise. And I'm using arbitrary y. This is just v of t of Jonathan. Okay, now for your question, and there is no question. Still there.
Jonathan said that because the noise is Gaussian distributed, so we can expect or we can deduce that the voltage will be also Gaussian distributed. So all we need to know is the average and the first order correlation. Is that supposed to be easy, clear, or?
Okay, so let me think if you see it in your exercise. Okay, so we'll insert another question in the exercise and you see it in the exercise. Small question, it's easy.
Last time I'm asking questions.
No, so keep asking. Like the exercise is written, but I'm using your questions to answer like small questions that you don't need to do anything. Just push a button in the computer, and so this is one of the questions. Okay. Okay. So how do we simulate it? It will be very similar to the Euler method, but different. So yn is just yn minus 1. N is the time n is the time step at time t, plus sigma times a times zn. I need to tell you what is a and what is zn. So zn is a Gaussian variable. So zi is IID. Do you know what is IID? So IID is independent, identical, distributed. You see what it means? So it's
IID is a coin.
IID is identical, is independent, identical, distributed.
Like a coin.
Like a coin, but not a coin. We see why it's not a coin. So it's random variable. So first of all, what does it mean that it's identical distributed? So I need to give you what is the distribution. So Zi is normally distributed with 0 mean and variance of 1.
What is
Random variable. Okay, so for example, the expected value of Zi is 0. Thanks. And what does it mean that they are independent? So independent, it means that, like intuitively, if I know Z1, I have no idea what will happen in Z2. Okay? So if I have Zi times Zj, and I'm looking at the expected value of this term, it's equal to delta ij. So this is delta of Kronecker, which means that if I equal to j, it's 1, and it's 0 otherwise. I'm putting in here that n is equal to t divided by the f. Okay. So you know everyone knows what is correlated. What is the uncorrelated variables? What is the covariance? Okay, so if you don't know these terms, please come next week to the. So it's stuff about joint probability and random variables in 2 or more dimensions. So please come next week. Yes. Monte Carlo is a big word for many processes where you have random variables. So you can call it a random Monte Carlo simulation. Yes. Okay. So we started 5 minutes later. So let me finish. Yes.
There is difference if it's like the crater of delta. If you have the Husset field, it's in the same page. Like in quantum mechanics, you have that without that like bracket. It's the same.
Yes. Quantum mechanics. But yes. Yes.
Maybe I missed something. Is it sigma or sigma square?
Well,
Small cell.
here it's sigma. Sigma.
Sigma?
Yes. Okay. So now we want to see what is A. And to calculate what is A, we want to see that this, we said that we don't really care about specific realization of Y, but we want to see that at least the expected value and the variance are the same like the analytical results that we saw before. So let's calculate the expected value and the variance. So first, the expected value of Y of t, or Y times n. So this is just the expected value, that's from here, right? The expected value of yn